cold January morning in Huntington, West Virginia, began like any other, quiet, gray, and still half asleep. But at 7:32 a.m., the silence broke. 6 unmarked police cars glided to a stop along Maple Street. Their engines idled low, headlights cutting through the fog as officers in tactical gear surrounded a modest 2-story home. Inside, 78-year-old David Kowalski stirred his coffee, unaware, or perhaps perfectly aware, of what was about to happen. For nearly 5 decades, Kowalski had been the embodiment of respectability. A retired high school chemistry teacher, community volunteer, and beloved grandfather. The kind of man who waved to neighbors, donated to school fundraisers, and tutored struggling students. No one on Maple Street suspected that behind the polite smile and pressed shirts lived a man who'd once strangled a 22-year-old college student in her dorm room back in 1971. Outside, an officer whispered, "Now." Fists hammered on the door. West Virginia State Police. "Open up." Kowalski set down his mug. The porcelain clink echoed across the kitchen tile. His hand trembled, but only slightly. When he opened the door, his face was calm, almost relieved, as if this moment had been circling him for half a century and had finally found its mark. You can almost picture it. The steam from his untouched coffee twisting upward as the cuffs clicked shut, the hum of radios, the stunned neighbors peering through curtains. A lifetime of lies collapsing in one measured breath. That morning, the town learned that evil doesn't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes, it mows its lawn, pays its taxes, and teaches your children chemistry. Before we reopen the cold case files that finally exposed his secret, take a moment to subscribe to Cold Case Files, where justice never expires. Because what happened on Maple Street proves one chilling truth. You can bury the past, but the past always remembers where you live. The sound that shattered the campus that morning wasn't a gunshot or a siren. It was a scream. A raw, jagged sound that tore through the quiet halls of Sycamore Hall just after 9:15 a.m. on March 16th, 1971. Moments earlier, sophomore Patricia Wilson had been standing outside her best friend's dorm room, knocking harder each time. "Kathy? You up?" she'd called, half laughing at first, then frowning when no answer came. The door was locked, unusual for this small, tight-knit college where most students still trusted their neighbors enough to leave doors ajar. When the resident advisor arrived with the master key, Patricia stood frozen in the hallway. The door opened with a sharp metallic click, and then came that scream. Katherine Fitzgerald lay motionless on the floor between her desk and bed, her textbooks scattered, her coffee cup overturned, steam still faintly rising from what had been her morning ritual. Campus security radioed for help. Code 1031. Possible homicide. Within minutes, Sheriff Thomas Hayward and Detective Frank Mullins arrived, disbelief etched across their faces. Cabell County wasn't the kind of place where young women were murdered in their dorms. It was a town of Sunday picnics and unlocked doors. The scene was eerily undisturbed. No broken glass, no forced entry, no sign of a struggle. But then Detective Mullins noticed something that made his pulse quicken. 2 coffee cups on the desk. One bore Kathy's fingerprints. The other, carefully wiped clean. It was a detail so small it might have been overlooked, yet it spoke volumes. The killer had been there long enough to share coffee, calm enough to erase his trace, confident enough to lock the door behind him and vanish. In that moment, the dorm room transformed from a place of study to a time capsule of terror. Mullins stood in the doorway, staring at the untouched cup, his jaw tightening. "This wasn't random," he muttered. "She knew whoever was here." "Eights." From that moment, Cabell County's most haunting cold case file began. If that detail gave you chills, hit like. It helps more people discover cold case files, where every clue, no matter how small, can bring a killer back into the light. Easy went. Detective Frank Mullins believed that if you could trace a victim's final hours, you could often glimpse their killer's shadow. And so, on that gray March afternoon, he began the painstaking task of reconstructing every moment of Katherine Fitzgerald's last night alive. The dorm room was sealed off, the air thick with the sterile scent of fingerprint powder and grief. On the desk sat her open chemistry notebook, neat, color-coded, pages filled with equations that would never be completed. Her watch had stopped at 9:26 m, likely from the shock when her body hit the floor. Beside it, a stack of library books. Human anatomy, the physiology of enzymes, medical ethics, and the future of women in science. The words now read like a haunting manifesto of a life that had been heading toward brilliance. According to witness statements, Katherine's Monday, March 15th, 1971, began like any other. She attended her morning comparative anatomy class at 8:30 a.m., took careful notes, and stayed behind afterward to ask a question about enzyme interactions. By 11:00, she was in advanced chemistry, her favorite subject. Professors remembered her as serious, focused, always precise. That afternoon, she met her friend Patricia Wilson in the cafeteria for lunch, chatting about the upcoming biology exam and joking about spring break plans. She was relaxed, laughing. Patricia later told investigators, nothing about her seemed off. She was just Kathy. 8s, from 2:30 to 5:00 p.m. She worked her usual library shift, assisting other students and shelving medical journals. Multiple witnesses confirmed she left the library around 5:30 p.m., heading toward the dining hall. Surveillance footage, grainy black and white film from a camera installed just weeks earlier, captured her entering the cafeteria alone, her books clutched tight against her chest. After dinner, she checked out 2 more library books at 7:15 p.m., one on organic compounds, another on behavioral psychology. It was a small detail that later haunted investigators. The last book she borrowed explored human motive. At 8:50 p.m., a hallmate remembered seeing her return to her dorm room, smiling faintly, her key in hand. The last confirmed phone record placed a call to her parents at 9:20 p.m. Her mother, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, recalled that conversation in her first police interview. She was happy. She talked about coming home for her father's birthday that weekend. She even reminded me to send his favorite lemon cake recipe to her dorm kitchen. There was nothing unusual, just love. 8s. Then came the final entry in her diary, written around midnight. The handwriting was neat but slightly rushed. Tired but accomplished today. Need to finish chem problem set before Wilson's class. Remember to mail Dad's card tomorrow. Summer internship application due Friday. Review once more. 8s. 9 hours later, she would be dead. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken lock, no disturbed window frame, no damaged hinges. The door had been locked from the inside, and the key was later found in the pocket of her jeans. For investigators, it was both a mystery and a message. Whoever entered that room was someone she let in willingly. Mullins leaned over the evidence table that night, rereading his notes. 2 cups of coffee, he murmured. That's not fear. That's trust. 8s. The phrase lingered in his mind for years. Trust, the single word that separated an ordinary evening from a nightmare. Whoever she invited in wasn't a stranger in the dark. It was someone who had earned her confidence, someone familiar enough to sit at her desk and share a quiet conversation. You can almost picture her, still studying under that small desk lamp, unaware her killer was already near. Forensic technicians reconstructed the room in three-dimensional photographs. Every object was cataloged. The untouched wallet, the lined-up pencils, the tidy bedspread. Even in death, Katherine's orderliness remained intact, as if her discipline refused to yield to chaos. But beneath her fingernails, lab technicians discovered something, a trace of skin tissue. Tiny, almost invisible. In 1971, it meant nothing. There was no DNA profiling, no genetic databases, no computers capable of parsing microscopic evidence. To Mullins, it was a small sliver of hope sealed in an envelope and placed in an evidence box marked fingernail scrapings, Fitzgerald. It would sit in the dark for nearly 50 years, waiting for science to evolve. As the investigation unfolded, contradictions multiplied. The security guard on duty swore no unauthorized visitors entered the building after 10 p.m. The sign-in log was clean. Her roommate was out of town. No one reported hearing a struggle, only a faint whistle from a kettle, and, around 11 p.m., muffled voices, calm and conversational. Detective Mullins began to feel the weight of something deeper than the case itself. A growing awareness that evil often hides in plain sight. He scribbled in his notebook, not a stranger, someone close. Someone she trusted enough to open the door. 8. Katherine's final hours painted a portrait not of chaos, but of chilling normalcy. A girl preparing for exams, calling her parents, planning her father's birthday, then opening the door to someone who would end her life with the same calm precision she brought to her studies. In towns like Milton, West Virginia, murder didn't fit the landscape. Locals prided themselves on familiarity, neighbors helping neighbors, doors unlocked, kindness assumed. That illusion shattered the morning Katherine was found. For the first time, residents realized that sometimes the person you trust most is the one who knows exactly how to hurt you. As Mullins zipped the evidence bag that night, he paused, staring at the 2 coffee cups now sealed in plastic. "One cup for her," he whispered, "and one for the devil she knew." 8. He couldn't have known that the fingerprints he searched for would remain elusive for half a century, or that the truth would only emerge when technology finally caught up with the lies of a man who smiled at her across that desk. Back then, they called it a tragedy. Today, it's a blueprint for how innocence meets calculation, a story that would one day define what we now call a cold case file. And in that locked dorm room, time stood still. A cup of coffee cooled. A life ended. And somewhere in the night, a killer walked out quietly, leaving behind only silence, trust betrayed, and a secret strong enough to survive 50 years of dust and denial. Before her name became a headline, before investigators sealed her dorm room in yellow tape, Katherine Ann Fitzgerald was simply Kathy, a bright, grounded young woman with a quiet smile and an unshakable belief that the world was good. To understand her death, you had to first understand her life, because in every cold case, the story of the victim is where the truth begins to breathe again. Born on June 12, 1948, in Charleston, West Virginia, Kathy was the first of 3 children in the Fitzgerald family. Her father, Michael Fitzgerald, was a civil engineer for the State Highway Department, a practical man who believed in hard work and routine. Her mother, Elizabeth, gave piano lessons out of their modest house on Consoy Boulevard, filling their home with music and the rhythmic discipline of scales. Neighbors remembered a small, polite girl with an almost old-fashioned sense of courtesy. She walked to school, rain or shine, carrying books that seemed nearly as tall as she was. She was always reading, said Mrs. Loring, an elderly neighbor interviewed years later. You'd see her sitting under that oak tree with her shoes off, reading medical books while the other kids played tag. 8. From the beginning, Kathy was different. Not distant, just focused. Her teachers described her as the student who never settled for good enough. She didn't chase attention or popularity, but when she spoke, people listened. She had this calm about her, recalled her high school chemistry teacher. Like she already knew where she was going. 8. And she did. Her dream, written in careful cursive beneath her senior photo in the 1967 Charleston High yearbook, read, "Plans to attend Marshall University and become a doctor." 8. For a working-class girl in the late 1960s, that was more than ambition. It was defiance. Her parents supported her completely. Her mother saved every spare dollar from piano lessons for tuition. Her father built her a small oak desk for her dorm room, a desk that, decades later, would appear in crime scene photographs, surrounded by textbooks and tragedy. At Marshall University, Kathy thrived. She wasn't loud or showy. She didn't dominate conversations or crave attention. But she was the kind of student everyone respected, the one who tutored her peers before exams, who stayed late in the library helping others understand formulas that came naturally to her. In the fall of 1969, she transferred from the bustling main campus in Huntington to a smaller satellite campus in Cabell County, hoping for more personalized instruction as she pursued her pre-med courses. The move suited her. The town of Milton was quiet, framed by the soft blue folds of the Appalachian Hills, where porch lights burned past midnight and the scent of wood smoke lingered in the air. She loved that place, said her younger sister, Margaret, in an interview decades later. She wrote to me about the way the mountains looked at sunset, how peaceful it was. She said it made her feel like she was part of something bigger. 8. You can picture her easily, a young woman in a simple cardigan, walking across a red brick courtyard with her notebooks hugged to her chest, hair catching the afternoon light. Not extraordinary by appearance, but radiating that particular brightness that comes from clarity of purpose. She wasn't naive, but she was trusting. She believed that if you were kind, people would be kind in return. That optimism, the kind that builds communities and binds families, would also be the flaw her killer exploited. Katherine's academic record was exceptional. Straight A's across every science course. Professors described her as brilliant but humble. She volunteered twice a week at the Cabell County Hospital, where she brought coffee to nurses on night shifts and read to elderly patients. It wasn't an assignment, just something she felt was right. Her diary, recovered after her death, offered a glimpse into her mind. The entries weren't dramatic or confessional, they were organized, almost methodical. Lists of study goals, notes of gratitude, reminders to call home. But every few pages, small fragments revealed her inner world. 8. Must remember that being strong doesn't mean not feeling. 8. Patricia says I worry too much. I think it's just that I see too much that others overlook. 8. Those words would haunt Patricia Wilson for decades, because Kathy did see what others overlooked. She just didn't see the danger coming for her. Psychologists who later reviewed her diary described Katherine's personality as high conscientiousness with a trusting disposition. She sought control through structure, believing that diligence could protect her from uncertainty. It was a mindset common among high-achieving women of her era, where success was hard-won, but danger was rarely imagined. On the morning of March 15th, 1971, her final day alive, Katherine woke early, as always. Her diary entry that morning read, "Tired but accomplished today. Need to finish chem problem set before Wilson's class. Remember to mail Dad's card tomorrow." 8s. Throughout that day, witnesses described her as upbeat and focused. She attended her classes, worked in the library, and had lunch with Patricia, who later recalled their conversation. She was worried about an upcoming exam, nothing unusual. She laughed when I told her she'd probably get another A anyway. 8s. That evening, Katherine ate dinner alone in the cafeteria, a habit not of loneliness, but of efficiency. She preferred to study while she ate. A dining hall employee remembered her leaving just after 7, carrying her books and a small thermos of coffee. Back in Sycamore Hall, the campus was quiet. The hallways smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain-soaked coats. She returned to her room around 8:50 p.m., greeted a hallmate, and locked the door. At 9:20 p.m., she called her parents, the last confirmed moment of her voice. Her mother later described that call to investigators. She sounded happy. She said she'd be home that weekend to celebrate her father's birthday. I told her not to overwork herself. She said, "I just want to make you proud." 8s. Think about your own college years, the sense that tomorrow is certain, that life stretches out like a promise you haven't yet broken. For Katherine, it wasn't. When detectives reconstructed her final hours, they found no evidence of fear. No defensive wounds beyond small bruises on her forearms. No barricaded door. No attempt to flee. She was likely standing when her killer approached from behind. There were 2 cups of coffee on her desk, one for her, one for the person she trusted enough to invite inside. That trust was her undoing. Later, psychological analysis suggested that her perfectionism, her need to see the best in people, to maintain harmony, might have made it difficult for her to recognize danger, even when it was inches away. She wasn't careless. She was kind. And in a world where cruelty often wears the mask of familiarity, kindness can be fatal. When her funeral was held in Charleston that spring, over 400 mourners attended. Former teachers, classmates, professors, even some who had only known her by reputation. Her father stood stoic beside her casket, his hand resting on the small wooden desk he'd built for her, now placed beside her photo. Years later, a journalist wrote, "If the measure of a life is the space it leaves behind, Katherine Fitzgerald's absence was a canyon." 8s. Her death became a wound that never fully closed, a reminder that evil doesn't always strike with warning, that sometimes it walks through the front door smiling. Her story would become one of America's most enduring cold case files, studied by detectives, retold in classrooms, whispered about by generations who grew up in the shadow of her loss. And yet, beyond the crime scene photographs and newspaper clippings, there remained the echo of who she truly was. A young woman who believed in decency, in possibility, and in people. She didn't live to see the world change, to see women enter medicine in numbers her professors once told her were impossible. But, in a way, her legacy would push those boundaries anyway. Her death would lead to new standards of campus safety across West Virginia. Her mother's advocacy would reshape state law, and her case would later fuel advances in forensic preservation that would help solve dozens of other murders. In the end, Katherine Fitzgerald was more than a victim. She was a catalyst, a symbol of how one life, however brief, can echo across generations of justice and science. And as her story continues, we'll trace every step she took on that final day, Each moment, each choice, preserved forever in the cold case files. Detective Frank Mullins didn't sleep the night after Katherine Fitzgerald's body was found. He sat in his small office at the Cabell County Sheriff's Department, the overhead light buzzing faintly, the scent of stale coffee and fingerprint powder clinging to his clothes. On the desk before him, a stack of handwritten witness statements, photographs, and evidence tags. In the center of it all, the Polaroid of a young woman lying still on a dorm room floor, her scarf twisted around her neck. He stared at it for a long time, the silence pressing in. "You deserve better," he muttered, then picked up his pen and began to draw the first circle of suspects. Beside him, Sheriff Thomas Hayward, a thick-set man with 2 decades on the force, leaned over the map of the Marshall University satellite campus. "We start close," he said. "Always start close." Eights. And that's what they did. For days, investigators combed through every corner of Sycamore Hall. They dusted for prints, measured shoe scuffs, cataloged fibers, and photographed everything that could speak or might, someday, when science caught up. They interviewed anyone who had seen Katherine in her final 24 hours. Classmates, professors, cafeteria workers, maintenance staff, even the mail carrier who'd passed through the dorm's lobby that morning. But the more they asked, the more the answers blurred together. She was quiet. Eights. She was smart. Eights. She didn't have enemies. Eights. The same words repeated, forming a portrait of someone who seemed beyond harm. And that was the problem. No one could imagine who would want her dead. If you were the detective, where would you start when everyone seems innocent? Mullins built his investigation outward in concentric circles. Circle 1, her immediate world. Friends, roommates, boyfriends, professors. Circle 2, the routine contacts. Library staff, fellow volunteers at the hospital, maintenance workers. Circle 3, the periphery. Anyone who might have crossed paths with her briefly, even by chance. By the end of the first week, his list held 27 names. The first was Thomas Mitchell, Katherine's former boyfriend. A graduate student on the main campus in Huntington, he'd dated her for 8 months before she ended it that January. Her diary hinted at tension, his possessiveness, his jealousy over her long study hours. It was enough for Mullins to drive to Huntington personally. Mitchell was pale and soft-spoken, clearly shaken by the murder. "I loved her," he said, eyes red-rimmed. "I'd never hurt her." His alibi placed him in a late-night study group the night of March 15th, 30 miles away. Phone records confirmed he'd made a call from his dorm phone around 11:30 p.m., squarely inside the estimated time of death. The story checked out. Still, Mullins took his fingerprints, his handwriting, and a hair sample, because in 1971, you couldn't afford to trust coincidence. Next came Raymond Lewis, a 43-year-old maintenance worker who'd been seen near the women's dorm after hours. A witness, student Janet Meadows, reported him walking down the hall around 10:30 p.m. He didn't have tools, she'd said, just nodded and said good evening. Lewis denied it all. "Must have been someone else," he insisted. But when detectives checked, hospital records proved he'd been admitted to Cabell County Hospital at 9:45 p.m. with a broken ankle. The wrong man, wrong time. Then there was Professor William Harris, Katherine's advanced chemistry instructor. Several students mentioned he'd taken an unusual interest in her, extra time after class, special projects. In the interview, Harris was indignant. "I was her mentor," he snapped. not her suitor. His wife corroborated his alibi. At home, grading papers, his teenage son watching television in the next room. His fingerprints didn't match any found at the scene. By early April, Mullins was exhausted. Each suspect he eliminated left him more uneasy, not less. "We're missing something," he told Sheriff Hayward. "Something obvious, hiding in plain sight." Eights. Hayward exhaled slowly. "This town doesn't breed killers, Frank. Maybe it was someone passing through." Eights. But Mullins shook his head. "No. Whoever did this knew her. She let him in." He pointed to the photograph of the coffee cups. "Look at this. 2 mugs. That's not an intruder. That's a guest." Eights. The sheriff didn't argue. There was nothing to say. Outside the sheriff's office, word had spread fast. Newspapers printed half-truths and speculation. Marshall student slain in dorm. No suspects identified. Parents pulled their daughters out of campus housing. Church sermons turned to fear. Milton had always been the kind of town where people waved from their porches. Now, curtains stayed drawn. The community's psyche was fracturing under the weight of something it didn't understand, the idea that evil could live next door. People began to eye each other differently. Students whispered in cafeterias about the man with the coffee cup. Eights. And still, the investigation stalled. Forensic limitations in 1971 were cruel. The fibers collected from Katherine's carpet couldn't be matched without modern spectrography. The partial prints from her desk were too smudged for comparison. The skin cells under her nails, the most valuable clue of all, were carefully preserved in a paper envelope, but technology to analyze them didn't exist yet. All Mullins could do was preserve everything he could, hoping that one day science would give the dead a voice. But for now, there were only leads that led nowhere. Weeks turned into months. Each morning, Mullins reopened the case file, and each night, he closed it with one more note of frustration. No new evidence, interviews repeated, alibis verified. Eights. He started to take the case personally. He visited the Fitzgerald home more than protocol required, often sitting with Elizabeth and Michael long after official updates were done. He saw the fatigue in their faces, the slow erosion of hope. "We just need to know why," Elizabeth said one evening, voice thin as thread. Mullins had no answer. Psychologists later described that period as a textbook example of investigator obsession. Mullins stopped taking other cases. He kept Katherine's photo on his desk long after the official inquiry slowed. He told colleagues he could feel her waiting, not for justice, but for someone to care enough not to forget. By September 1971, the suspect list had grown to more than 100 names. Every one of them cleared. Each interview felt like a door closing. The sheriff finally made the inevitable decision: to classify the case as open but inactive. It was a bureaucratic way of saying cold. Eights. When Mullins signed the final report, his pen lingered at the bottom of the page. "I'm not done," he whispered. But for the world outside his office, the story was fading. New headlines pushed Katherine's name down the page. Students returned to class. Sycamore Hall reopened. And life, or something resembling it, resumed. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of Milton, something had changed forever. Parents locked their doors. Young women stopped walking home alone. The sense of safety that had defined the town was gone, replaced by an invisible tension that would last for generations. Mullins kept a box of personal notes labeled Fitzgerald under his desk. Each lead, each failure, each dead end was recorded in his tight handwriting. Later, those notes would become vital to the case's revival. But in 1971, they were simply the record of a man who refused to stop asking the same question. Who could she have trusted enough to let in? And with every passing week, that question grew heavier until it became more than an investigation. It became a haunting. Every interview added another page to West Virginia's growing archive of cold case files. Subscribe if you believe some stories must be told until justice is found. This is Cold Case Files. By late autumn of 1971, the file labeled Fitzgerald, Katherine Ann had grown thick enough to need its own box. Inside were hundreds of pages, typed reports, smudged Polaroids, chain of custody tags tied to glass vials, coffee cups sealed in plastic, fibers tucked into envelopes, and one small paper packet marked in Detective Mullen's handwriting. Fingernail scrapings, possible assailant tissue. 8. On September 22nd, Sheriff Thomas Hayward called a press conference in the wood-paneled meeting room of the Cable County Courthouse. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters asked the same question they had asked for months. Do you have a suspect? 8. Hayward cleared his throat, his voice rough from too many sleepless nights. The investigation remains open, he said carefully. We've interviewed over 100 individuals. At this time, we have no one in custody. But I promise the Fitzgerald family and this community we will never stop looking. 8. It was the kind of promise lawmen made when they had nothing else to give. Outside the courthouse, the sky hung low and gray. The wind carried the smell of rain and something heavier, disappointment. Inside, Mullins packed away the evidence himself. He wrapped each item in clean paper, labeled it in his neat block handwriting, and signed the custody log. Item 42, 2 ceramic coffee cups. Item 43, scarf, blue, ligature marks consistent. Item 44, personal diary, partial blood stain on cover. See? As the evidence locker door clanged shut, the sound echoed like a verdict. Back in his office, Mullins stared at the empty desk where the case file had sat for months. He should have felt relief. The endless interviews, the late nights, the blind alleys, they were over. But all he felt was failure. We had her killer in front of us, he told a colleague years later. I could feel it, but I couldn't prove it. Ease! Across town, the Fitzgerald family was living in a house that felt hollow without Kathy. Her father, Michael, returned to work, moving like a man underwater. Her mother, Elizabeth, stopped teaching piano. The sound of music in their home was replaced by the quiet ticking of clocks. Every creak of the floorboards made her look up, hoping for footsteps that would never come. At night, she sat by Kathy's old desk, the one her husband had built, and reread her daughter's letters, searching for some hidden clue, a line that might reveal what she'd missed. Was there someone she feared? Someone she trusted too much? She wrote notes in the margins, circled dates, drew question marks. It was her way of continuing the investigation that the county had stopped. Grief has many faces, but in the Fitzgerald home, it mutated into something sharper. Obsession. Elizabeth called the sheriff's office weekly. She clipped every newspaper article about the case. When new officers joined the department, she mailed them handwritten letters, reminders that her daughter's killer was still out there. Would you be able to sleep knowing your sister's killer might live down the street? For Margaret, Kathy's teenage sister, the question wasn't hypothetical. Every trip to the grocery store felt like a roll of the dice. Every polite smile from an older man carried the faint chill of possibility. Detective Mullins, too, couldn't escape it. Once a month, he reopened the box and flipped through the photographs, the evidence tags, the diary pages written in that careful, even script. Sometimes he imagined her sitting at that desk again, her pen gliding across paper, utterly unaware of the danger behind her. By Christmas, the case had gone completely still. Leads dried up. The phone stopped ringing. Newspapers shifted to new headlines: politics, sports, the upcoming election. Katherine Fitzgerald became a memory, a story people lowered their voices to mention. But down in the basement archives of the sheriff's department, the evidence box remained. Dust gathered on its lid, but inside, time was perfectly preserved: coffee cups, scarf fibers, fingernail scrapings, each piece waiting for a future that might finally understand it. It would join the shelves of forgotten cold case files, waiting for science to catch up. The Fitzgerald house on Kanawha Boulevard never stopped being a crime scene, at least not in spirit. The walls that had once echoed with piano music and laughter became lined with silence, interrupted only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of paper turning. For Michael Fitzgerald, Katherine's father, grief became a discipline. Every night, after his wife went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a leather-bound notebook and began to write. His handwriting was sharp, deliberate, like an engineer drawing blueprints, only now he was trying to rebuild something intangible: the truth. He recorded every phone call with the sheriff's office, every rumor, every article clipping. When the investigation went quiet, he created his own. He mapped the geography of Milton, marking names, addresses, possible suspects. He tracked anniversaries, newspaper mentions, even weather patterns from March 1971, as though somewhere amid all those data points the killer might still be hiding. By the time Michael passed away in 1994, those notebooks filled 17 volumes, 17 years of obsession disguised as method. They would later serve as an unofficial chronicle of the investigation's decay, a father's attempt to keep his daughter's story alive when the world seemed ready to forget her. Elizabeth Fitzgerald's grief took a different form. The day after the sheriff declared the case inactive, she packed away her piano books and stopped teaching altogether. But silence wasn't surrender. By 1973, she'd transformed her anguish into activism, founding West Virginia Families for Justice, an organization for relatives of murder victims whose cases had gone cold. At first, it was just 4 families meeting in the Fitzgerald living room, sharing coffee and loss. But word spread quickly. Within a decade, the group had hundreds of members across the state, lobbying for better evidence preservation laws and the creation of a state cold case review team. In legislative hearings, Elizabeth spoke softly but with the authority of someone who'd stared grief in the face and refused to blink. "My daughter's killer took more than her life," she told the state assembly in 1978. "He took our peace, our trust in the world, but he will not take our determination." Eights. That testimony would lead to new state legislation mandating longer retention of forensic evidence and standardized evidence storage protocols, a quiet revolution in justice reform that rippled far beyond West Virginia. Her mother's fight would redefine how America treated its cold case files. Margaret Fitzgerald, 16 years old when her sister was murdered, grew up in the long shadow of that loss. She remembered watching her father pore over his notebooks until dawn, remembered her mother mailing letters to congressmen, and decided she would fight from within the system. She abandoned her dream of studying literature and enrolled in law school instead. By 1980, she'd become one of the youngest prosecutors in Kanawha County, specializing in violent crimes. "I couldn't save my sister," she later told a reporter, "but I could make sure other families never felt as powerless as we did." Eights. Margaret's colleagues described her as relentless, always composed, never cruel. She treated every victim's file like it was personal, because for her, it was. Every case she tried was another echo of Katherine's story, a young life cut short, a family left behind. Through the decades, the Fitzgerald family became a symbol of persistence in the face of silence. On anniversaries of Katherine's death, Elizabeth sent handwritten notes to the Cabell County Sheriff's Department. Sometimes they were updates from her advocacy work. Sometimes they were simply reminders. We're still here. She mattered. 8. Detective Frank Mullins, who had led the original investigation, never threw those letters away. He pinned each one to a bulletin board in his office until his retirement in 1992. Every March 16th, he took down the box labeled Fitzgerald and reopened it, spreading out the photos and notes across the table, as if reviewing the evidence might somehow reverse time. If there's such a thing as haunting, he told a younger colleague, this is it. 8. You can almost picture it. The aging detective in a dim office, the ticking of a wall clock marking another year gone, another unanswered question left on the table beside that photograph of a smiling 22-year-old student. Grief has a strange gravity. It pulls everyone differently. For the Fitzgeralds, it never loosened its grip. It merely reshaped itself through generations. By the 1990s, the family's tragedy had become local folklore. People whispered the story in Milton cafes and at university events. The girl who trusted someone she shouldn't have, the killer who vanished, the family who never stopped fighting. Katherine's name appeared in anniversary articles every few years, her photo yellowed by newsprint, but her eyes forever alive. Each time, Elizabeth wrote the same letter to the editor. This is not folklore. This is our ongoing nightmare. 8. But beneath the public resilience, there was exhaustion. Decades of advocacy had taken their toll. Activism had kept Elizabeth alive, but it also tethered her to the wound. She never left that year, Margaret once said. Every day was 1971 for her. 8. That's what unresolved grief does. It traps time. Psychologists call it survivor's guilt, but for the Fitzgeralds, it was something deeper. Moral fatigue. The kind that seeps into the bones after years of demanding answers that never come. Michael's notebooks sat untouched after his death, the ink fading, the edges curling. Margaret boxed them carefully and stored them in her attic, unable to throw them away, but unable to keep looking, either. It felt like the investigation was still breathing, she said later. Like he'd just stepped out of the room and would come back to keep writing. 8. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued her advocacy well into her 80s. Even as her health declined, she wrote op-eds about the need for a technological investment in forensic science. She followed every news story about breakthroughs in DNA testing. When the Golden State Killer was arrested in 2018 using genetic genealogy, she clipped the article and circled the headline in red. Beneath it, she wrote 3 words. This could work. 8. If it were your family, could you live with not knowing for 50 years? Could you carry the same wound through half a century of holidays, birthdays, graduations, each one marked not by joy, but by absence? For the Fitzgeralds, the answer was yes. Not because they were stronger than anyone else, but because they had no other choice. When people in Milton spoke of hope, they often meant the Fitzgeralds. Even as their house aged and their faces lined with years, they remained the living proof that grief and perseverance could coexist. And perhaps, deep down, that quiet faith was contagious. Because somewhere in the same county, packed away in a climate-controlled archive, Detective Mullins' box of evidence still waited, patient as the mountains, untouched by time, holding the secret that would one day prove Elizabeth right. Justice hadn't vanished. It was just sleeping. The Fitzgeralds didn't know it yet, but their decades of endurance were about to collide with a new era of forensic science, one powerful enough to reach across generations and bring the truth home. Tap the bell icon so you never miss stories where hope outlasts decades, only on Cold Case Files. By the time the Fitzgerald case reached its 48th year, the original Polaroids had faded to sepia and the paper tags on the evidence bags had gone brittle with age. Yet inside one of those bags, sealed, labeled, and long forgotten, lay the microscopic fragment that would rewrite history. In 2019, Detective Sarah Keller sat in her office at the Cable County Sheriff's Department, the same building where Mullins had worked half a century earlier. On her desk was the box marked Fitzgerald, Catherine Ann, March 16, 1971. The cardboard was discolored, but the handwriting was still legible. Mullins's careful block letters, each stroke steady, each label a promise. Keller was 41, meticulous, and known in the department for her quiet persistence. When she'd been assigned to the cold case unit 4 years earlier, she'd made a vow. She wouldn't just review the past, she'd resurrect it. That afternoon, she unsealed the box with a scalpel, breathing in the faint, musty air of history. Inside were the coffee cups, the scarf, the diary, and finally, the small paper envelope labeled fingernail scrapings, possible assailant tissue. She held it delicately, as though it were something sacred. And in a way, it was the last physical trace of a life taken too soon. You've seen headlines about DNA solving decades-old murders, but imagine holding that evidence in your hands, knowing one mistake could erase the truth forever. Forensic science had come a long way since 1971. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, launched by the FBI in the 1990s, had revolutionized criminal investigations by allowing agencies nationwide to compare genetic profiles. But CODIS depended on luck. It could only match a sample if the perpetrator's DNA was already in the database. Keller knew the odds were slim. Catherine's killer had never been arrested, never fingerprinted, never entered into the system. But science, like justice, had evolved. By 2018, a new frontier had emerged, genetic genealogy. Using vast public databases where people uploaded DNA to learn about their ancestry, investigators could identify suspects not through direct matches, but through their relatives. The method had caught the Golden State Killer, a man who'd evaded capture for over 40 years. To Keller, that case wasn't just a headline. It was a sign. She submitted a formal request for reanalysis of the Fitzgerald evidence. In her memo, she wrote, "We've preserved this case with integrity for nearly 5 decades. The science finally exists to give her a voice." 8. Approval came within a week. In February 2019, the box was shipped under armed escort to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, one of the few private laboratories capable of extracting genetic material from severely degraded samples. It was a last chance, and everyone involved knew it. At Parabon, the sample was assigned to Dr. Eleanor Wright, a forensic genetic genealogist whose quiet, methodical brilliance had solved more than a dozen historic cases. Her team worked in near silence, the hum of machines blending with the click of pipettes. What they had to work with was astonishingly small, 0. 4 nanograms of degraded DNA, barely enough to register on modern instruments. Under normal conditions, Dr. Wright later explained, that amount would be unusable. But the beauty of modern amplification is that we can give even a whisper of DNA a voice. 8. Using whole genome amplification, they made millions of copies of the fragment without corrupting its structure. Slowly, a profile began to form, Thousands of data points, tiny sequences of code spelling out the genetic blueprint of a stranger who'd once walked freely through Milton. Still, the tension was immense. One error in the amplification could destroy everything. The lab team double-checked every reading, every sequence alignment, every temperature calibration. "You could feel the pressure in the room," said a technician who worked that day. It wasn't just science, it was history watching us. 8. Meanwhile, in Huntington, Keller waited. She knew not every cold case revived by DNA ended in closure. Sometimes the samples were too degraded. Sometimes they pointed nowhere. Every time her phone buzzed, she braced for disappointment. Weeks passed. The winter air outside her office grew warmer, the first hints of spring returning to West Virginia. She found herself walking the same routes Katherine might have walked to class, tracing invisible footsteps through the present. "I felt her everywhere," she would later say. The case had become more than evidence. It was like she was waiting for us to finish what Mullins started. 8. Then, on March 21st, 2019, the call came. "Detective Keller, Dr. Wright said over the line, "We have a viable profile." 8. Keller exhaled, gripping the edge of her desk. "Are you sure?" 8. Positive. It's complete enough for genealogical comparison. 8. The profile was uploaded to a public database. Within hours, results began to populate the screen. No direct matches, but 17 individuals who shared distant genetic markers with the unknown killer. Most were third or fourth cousins. None had any criminal records. That's where the real detective work began. For months, Dr. Wright's team built family trees, tracing bloodlines back through the 1800s, mapping marriages, births, and migrations. Names branched like veins across digital pages. Each connection was a potential key. Finally, by cross-referencing geographical records and narrowing age ranges, the web began to tighten. Out of nearly 400 possible descendants, only 7 men fit the criteria. Men who would have been between 18 and 40 in 1971, men with ties to Cabell County. One of them was David Kowalski, a name buried in the original 1971 witness list. Keller froze when she saw it. The man had been interviewed once, briefly, as a chemistry teacher who occasionally tutored college students. His alibi had been confirmed by his wife. He'd never been questioned again. For a moment, Keller just stared at the name, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She thought about Mullins, about Elizabeth Fitzgerald, about every anniversary article that ended with the same phrase. The killer remains unknown. 8. Not anymore. But she knew better than to celebrate early. DNA was a science of certainties, not instincts. She needed a direct sample to confirm the match. So, she waited, watched, and planned. Kowalski was 78 now, retired, still living in Huntington, the same city where he'd once built his reputation as a beloved educator. Keller assigned a surveillance team. For 3 days, they followed him, grocery store, park, post office. Then came the opportunity. A discarded paper coffee cup at a local cafe. The cup was sealed and rushed to the lab. 3 days later, the results arrived. The DNA from the rim of that cup matched the sample from under Katherine Fitzgerald's fingernails with a probability of 98%. After 48 years, science had finally spoken. Keller sat in silence, staring at the report. Relief and horror arrived at once, the realization that the killer had never left, that he'd lived among them all this time, his name printed in the local newspaper, his face smiling in old yearbooks. That night, she wrote in her case log, The new era of cold case files was born from the marriage of science and patience. 8. When the arrest warrant was signed and the team prepared for the dawn raid, she tucked one of Mullen's original photos into her folder. The image of Katherine's desk, 2 coffee cups side by side. As the sun rose over Huntington on January 15th, 2019, the past was finally about to meet the present. If your heart's racing right now, you're not alone. This is why we reopened the cold case files. When the confirmation finally came through, a 98% DNA match between the material found under Katherine Fitzgerald's fingernails and the sample from a discarded coffee cup, Detective Sarah Keller didn't cheer. She didn't even speak. She just sat there, staring at the report as though it were written in another language. The silence in the room was heavy. This was the moment every cold case investigator dreamed of and dreaded at once. Dreamed of because it meant justice. Dreaded because justice this late always carried ghosts. The name on the report read, David Kowalski, 78 years old, retired chemistry professor, former high school teacher, longtime community volunteer, a man who had attended fundraisers for the very scholarship named after his victim. Keller's pulse thudded as she flipped through the digitized 1971 case files. There it was, his name, mentioned twice, barely noticed. Interviewed as a witness, the note said. Alibi confirmed by wife. He'd lived his entire life in plain sight, under the radar, under everyone's trust. The arrest was scheduled for the morning of January 15th, 2019. Before sunrise, 6 unmarked vehicles rolled quietly down Maple Street in Huntington, West Virginia. The winter air bit sharp, fog coiling from exhaust pipes as tactical officers positioned themselves around a modest 2-story home with blue shutters and a white porch. At 7:32 a.m., Keller approached the door with the warrant in her hand. Behind her, cameras stayed off. No one spoke. Inside, David Kowalski was making coffee, his morning ritual, as he had for nearly 5 decades. When he opened the door, he didn't flinch at the sight of the officers. He just set down his mug, hands trembling slightly. His eyes met Keller's. Mr. Kowalski, she said quietly, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1971 murder of Katherine Fitzgerald. 8. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a voice thin with age but disturbingly calm, he said, I was wondering when you'd come. 8. How would you feel if your favorite teacher turned out to be a murderer? By noon, the news had exploded across Cabell County. A man who had spent decades shaping young minds was now accused of strangling one of his brightest students to death nearly 50 years earlier. Former students called local radio stations in disbelief. Dr. K. No way, one said. He wrote me a college recommendation letter. A city council member, once his colleague, muttered to a reporter, he was the best of us. 8. But behind every soundbite was the same collective horror, the realization that a murderer had lived among them, admired and respected, for half a century. As Keller briefed the media that afternoon, her voice wavered only once. The evidence speaks clearly, she said. The DNA is irrefutable. After 48 years, the truth has spoken for Katherine Fitzgerald. 8. Meanwhile, psychologists who reviewed the case described Kowalski as the embodiment of repression, a man who compartmentalized his crime so completely that he could perform goodness as convincingly as he once performed murder. He'd lived 2 lives, one visible, one buried beneath decades of denial. His neighbors described him as kind, thoughtful, always offering to shovel driveways or fix fences. But inside his basement, investigators would later find a small box wrapped in cloth, containing newspaper clippings about the Fitzgerald case and one ceramic coffee cup. The missing cup. The discovery silenced whatever doubt remained. The story of Cabell County's model citizen was over. The story of the murderer who fooled an entire community was just beginning. His name would forever be etched into the cold case files that once defined mystery, and now defined justice. If you believe truth always surfaces, subscribe. Cold Case Files proves it every week. In the spring of 2020, just 1 year after the sentencing of David Kowalski, Elizabeth Fitzgerald passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 93. On her nightstand rested a single newspaper clipping, the headline from the year before: Katherine Fitzgerald's killer sentenced after 48 years. Ates, her daughter, Margaret, found the paper folded neatly beside her reading glasses. No other words, no letter. She didn't need one. For nearly half a century, Elizabeth had carried the weight of an unanswered question. Now, finally, she could rest. At her funeral, Margaret stood before a small congregation of family, friends, and law enforcement officers who had spent their lives chasing truth. "My mother's mission wasn't revenge," she said softly. "It was remembrance." She believed that even if the world forgets, justice doesn't. Not really. It just waits for the right hands to open the right box. Ates. That same year, the FBI Academy added the Fitzgerald investigation to its cold case training curriculum, a case study in evidence preservation, patience, and the transformative power of science. Detectives from across the country now study the same files that once sat in a dusty West Virginia basement. Instructors emphasize one detail above all: Detective Mullins's insistence on sealing those fingernail samples in 1971. That decision, a single moment of caution, became the bridge between eras, between analog and digital, between silence and revelation. Outside Huntington, the site of the demolished Sycamore Hall was transformed into a memorial garden. A simple bronze plaque reads, Ates, in memory of Katherine Ann Fitzgerald, 1948-1971. She dreamed of healing others. Through her story, she still does. Ates. On warm evenings, students from Marshall University walk the same ground where Katherine once studied, unaware that the soil beneath their feet holds half a century of history. But for those who know the story, the detectives, the family, the people who still lower their voices when they say her name, that place is sacred. It's proof that even the coldest of cases can breathe again. For Detective Keller, the end of the case was not victory, but reflection. "We don't really solve these things," she said in a 2021 interview. "We just uncover what time tried to hide." Justice doesn't erase grief, it gives it direction. Ates. The Fitzgerald case became more than a story of murder. It became a story of endurance, of a family's unwavering belief that truth outlives lies, of a community forced to confront the darkness within its own reflection, and of a nation realizing that justice isn't always swift, but it is patient. Psychologists who studied the aftermath called it collective healing, the phenomenon that occurs when an entire town faces its ghosts together. The residents of Cabell County began attending annual candlelight vigils at the Memorial Garden, not just for Katherine, but for all the names still waiting in unmarked folders across America. Maybe you're watching this late at night, lights off, wondering how many other secrets lie buried in America's quiet towns. That curiosity, the need to know, is what keeps justice alive. It's what makes ordinary people remember extraordinary tragedies and ask, what if this time we could find the truth? Ates. Catherine's story began with silence, but it ends with something stronger, the sound of science meeting faith, of persistence turning into proof. Her life, and her mother's fight, remind us that no matter how much time passes, the truth never really disappears. It just waits. Join us as we reopen America's forgotten cold case files, because time may pass, but the truth never fades. Subscribe, share, and stay tuned for the next cold case files, where science brings the past back to justice.